You do what when you're playing D&D? You're insane. If there's one thing I've learned from all my years of playing D&D and TTRPGs anywhere really, is that the game you play can vary from table to table wildly. You play with the same group time after time, and then you go play with someone else and your mind's just blown by how different things are at their table. Some of these changes might be really big, different interpretations of the rules, homebrew, or just etiquette, how spicy things can get. But it's actually the small things that can really make the difference between tables that I'm kind of interested in. So let's discuss 5 little things that can really change the game of D&D. The number of players at the table. How many people you play with can wildly change your game. And there are some game types that work differently with different numbers of players. I used to think playing single player, that's one player and one DM, was kind of sad and a sign you just didn't have enough friends. But some games just have more interesting results with just one character. Horror-themed games have a bigger impact when you have only yourself to rely on with no support. A zombie, which is usually like a mob creature, is much more terrifying when you are first level and alone. Over 20 hit points and the ability to just get back up after you've killed it, that's pretty scary. Single play is also good to advance personal quests. Maybe the wizard wants to build a wizard's tower, or the rogue search out an enemy and settle some kind of score. It can be more interesting to conquer those trials by yourself, and the rest of the party doesn't have to feel left out as you take over the show. Personal quests can be very rewarding, and playing one-on-one is pretty unique. Now, having 2 players, that's like Holmes and Watson, or Starsky and Hutch. Can make it for a good buddy cop kind of story, or superhero and sidekick. You don't see a lot of that kind of thing in D&D. 3 players is becoming more common. The Dungeon Dudes use that, as does the Dingle Doodles Fool's Gold campaign. Usually mostly 3. It's in the power of the characters to keep from getting blitzed by hard encounters, but still small enough of a party for everyone to get their time to shine for quests and roleplay. 4 players used to be the standard. You have the tank, the healer, the caster, and the rogue. Yeah, the rogue was so important it needed its own category. Notice the lack of any charisma-based characters there. That didn't used to be as needful as it is now. But I don't think it's the standard anymore. I think that goes to 5 players, which is what I have on my table. It's a good, comfortable number that seems like it can take on any challenges without the fear of accidentally being TPK'd. And it's got room for that charisma character in there too. 6 and up can really start to bog down the game. When combat comes along and it gets to your turn and you've already fallen asleep. Going from a small party to a big party can be a really stark transition. Next, the size of the battle map you use. Now, I still assert that play maps and minis need not be as expensive or time-consuming of a fair as most think. Seriously, look at the back of any wrapping paper. Most have a 1x1 inch grid. Just use that to pinch. With some candy pieces for the minis instead. Simple. But the difference it makes to the game from one size map to a different size map is very surprising. A few years ago, the person who DMs for me upgraded his battle map to be about 50% bigger. And man, did it make a difference. All of a sudden, the balance between melee and range just swung like a pendulum. I used to think Spiritual Weapon was an amazing spell. So did WotC because they just nerfed it. I still think it's pretty good, but the Spiritual Weapon only has a movement speed of 15 feet. Doesn't sound like a big deal until you put it on a bigger map and watch it meander around from fight to fight, just not really getting anywhere. Yeah, more space means it can take longer than your base movement to get to the enemy, and range combat, especially long range, becomes much more powerful. There's also a lot of different types of battle maps, those with graphics and those without. Obviously, whatever minis you might have around, or if you just draw on the map. I grew up with graph paper and a pencil. Didn't even have minis. It was just a single letter with a circle to represent where you were. You had to erase it every time you moved. Now let's go from different battle maps to no battle maps, which we also call theater of the mind. It's just using your imagination and the DM's descriptions to know where you are on the field, what you're seeing, and the terrain. For instance, during the pandemic, our group couldn't get together, of course, and we didn't want to shell out money for the VTTs. Well, we'll get to that in a minute. We just played over Zoom with Theater of the Mind. And this was very different from what we were used to, outside of the technical hurdles, of course. Some of us like to play very tactically with certain builds and spells. Throwing down a spike growth when there is no battle map can be a bit challenging when you don't have a clear idea of where everything is. But social encounters are really boosted because you're forced to be more introspective with your character. Combat isn't as attractive an option anymore. Some people will love it, and some will hate it. It's a lot less complicated because it doesn't require pulling out a map and drawing on it and getting out the minis. It can be very successful. The aforementioned Dungeon Dudes Drakenheim games are usually Theater of the Mind. Speaking of VTTs, there are VTTs. Virtual Tabletop. Now, the idea of playing D&D online is by no means a new one. Back in the 80s, one of the few free things to do on the internet was to visit chat boards. Yes, most things on the internet back then, even visiting websites, cost money. And those chat boards were used to play D&D and other games even as far back as then. But VTTs have evolved considerably, and there are some good ones. Roll20, Foundry, Fantasy Grounds, to name a few. Obviously, a system that lets you play a completely supported TTRPG with people from around the world can be quite different. It's a lot more convenient to find people to play with and easier to set up games when you can play from your own home with other people from their home. But that is not the only reason to use a VTT. I know many who use VTTs even when they're just playing in person together. Some players can have a really hard time keeping the rules and conventions of RPGs in their heads. How many dice does a fireball use? Is it a D8 or a D6? I make an attack. What do I roll? Is it a D20? Things like that can be very obvious to some, but others really struggle with no matter how often they play. That doesn't mean they're stupid. It's just not how their brain works. It also doesn't help that when you're trying to count all the math rock click-clacks together, everyone's staring at you, waiting for you to finish so they can take their turn. It's a lot of pressure. It makes those mental gymnastics a bit harder for them to deal with. But that doesn't mean they don't want to play. They want to play D&D with their friends. But all the rules and math can be a bit daunting, but a VTT can smooth those rough edges out. It can shoulder a lot of the weight of calculations and rules for the player. It determines the dice to roll and the rules to use. Kind of, like a video game, actually. And this can make the game a bit more comfortable to play for those that can struggle with the dice and the rules. And finally, we come to what I personally think is the most controversial change, bonus action potions. This is a homebrew rule that has been floating around for a good while, so much so that it has made its way into the newest edition of D&D. Now, some YouTubers generally insist that everyone was already using this change. I question if that's more of a self-fulfilling prophecy. They say everyone is doing this, and someone watches the video and thinks, well, why aren't we doing this? And it just snowballs from there. Now, I don't personally use this rule at my table because I think D&D 5e is already a very survivable game, and just letting everyone drink healing potions as a bonus action would just make that problem worse. Now, that isn't a criticism of the new edition, as I haven't seen the new DMG or the Monsters Manual. I don't know if the survivability of D&D is still going to be a problem. I've already heard that the DMG has significantly increased the difficulty of higher level encounters, so this might be a necessary change. But one problem that this change does help solve might be a little unexpected, and that's hoarding. Because potions are a limited resource, and because normally it's difficult to justify an action to use one unless it's absolutely necessary, players can tend to hoard their consumable items. When you have a spendable magical item or piece of equipment, it's easy to always be looking for just the right time to make use of it. You never know if you'll ever get another one. But it's also just as likely that the perfect circumstances don't ever appear, and you never make use of those items, and you just keep building them up. This can be a problem for the DM as well, because if you hoard them too much, they may be disinclined to give you more for fear that you'll dump them all at once and steamroll the big bad. But if it only takes a bonus action to use them, then you might be more inclined to make use of those potions, even if it isn't the most optimal situation. A player may have nothing to use their bonus action on for that particular turn and realize that, they could use a top off of healing and still be able to attack or cast a spell in the same round. It won't hurt their action economy much. I will say that the new player's handbook only specifies that certain potions, healing potions, antitoxin, for example, can be used as a bonus action, not potions in general. It could be that the certain potions will be used as a bonus action, others as an action. This may be made clearer in the new DMG when it's released. We'll have to wait and see. But there are some minor, or maybe not so minor, changes to the way you might play D&D that could drastically alter the game for you. If you have any tips or tricks to share, leave them in the comments below. While you're down there, be sure to subscribe, ring the bell, and smash that like button. Until next time on Roleplay Culture.